And turning back now to former Japanese Prime Minister Abe's death, he served in that office longer than anyone before stepping down in 2020. And news of his death has rattled the mostly peaceful country this morning, especially because Japan has one of the lowest rates of gun violence in the world, making his assassination a particularly extraordinary act of violence. A lot to delve into here, and for more on this, let's bring in Professor Nancy Snow. She is an international relations expert and also a former Abe Fellow and Fulbright Scholar in Japan. Professor, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a long day.
I can imagine. I can imagine. I guess we'll start out just by talking about how unprecedented this all is, especially considering we were just saying how rare this is in Japan, where it also has one of the world's strictest gun violence laws.
That's right. But let me just give you the setting of where Abe was in Nara, Japan, just outside Kyoto. Many tourists go there. That's where you have the very placid deer. It's a very sort of rural setting. This was not a huge crowd. And the people were gathered quite closely to him with limited security. This is that feeling you get when you're in Japan. Yes, there is some violence. It's minimal, but not gun violence. And not only is it rare to be able to own a gun, but nobody wants to own a gun. I mean, that's the difference. They're repelled by it. It's culturally inappropriate for a country where a social contract, the social collective, is so meaningful. The Japanese are known to be so polite and very concerned about the other person because it's often very crowded in the big cities. So you really honor and respect the other person. And being disarmed is part of that feeling. And my heart is broken today for the Japanese people, because no longer will they feel that they're a bit of the exception to the violent rule that we see throughout the world. And I'm afraid this is going to be a public trauma, a national trauma. I feel it, and I'm at my home in New York. I was just in Japan a few weeks ago. But it's so, Abe's legacy is one thing, and it's incredible, and I've written a lot about that, but this is so much more, and it really plays into how the Japanese view themselves as a peaceful nation, as a beautiful people that the world over wants to visit. It's the #1 country now that everyone wants to visit as we come out of the COVID period.
Nancy, you make such a really, really interesting point about the culture, right? Because as you know, we've been dealing with a rash of public shootings and killings here in this country, and we sort of immediately go back to, well, the laws. What sort of laws do we need to restrict and control? We never talk about the culture, right? The gun culture in this country. And I suspect you need both. So you've sort of talked about the uniqueness of the Japanese culture. Can you talk to us, though, about the gun laws there?
Yes, you actually have to register. You have the police who come into your home on an annual basis. You have to go through a very lengthy background check. I mean, it is so sort of bothersome and cumbersome. But again, so few people would do this. Some hunters might do it, but it is so limited. And especially when I talk to young people or I talk to everyday Japanese, it's hard to even have a discussion about guns. It's not a debate. It's not even on the table as a debate. They just don't understand it. They have come a long way in the last century to the present, and they just see it as so inhuman that we have outgrown this as a modern society. They wouldn't think of arming themselves individually like that because it would break that social compact that we all feel when we're there.
You know, our correspondent, Elizabeth Palmer, had said that part of the process is you essentially have to have references. They want to interview your family members to get to know whether or not you have any violent tendencies at all. I think we would consider that particularly invasive here, but
we would. Yeah. There's no question. I think it would be comparable to, say, the federal background check I went through years ago when I worked for the State Department and the U.S. Information Agency. That went on for months, and they talked to friends of friends. I don't know if they got into a violent past, but it's completely acceptable in Japan because, again, no one wants to own a gun. And so it's just not a discussion. And yet at the same time, I try to tell them it's a very different culture in the U.S. I use the same sort of cultural reference that it's not just a constitutional issue here, but it is that right, that freedom equalizer, as some would call it. They don't see it that way, and they'll never see it that way. And I appreciated that because I respect differences in cultures. And again, I'm so sorry about the loss of Shinzo Abe. I often had some criticism of Abe's policies, but not the person. He will be so missed for Japan. He was a 67, relatively young in Japan terms, but an elder statesman in nation brand Japan in this century.
Well, and I was going to ask you about that, just the legacy that he leaves behind and how people have felt about him, because he has been on the stage there for so long, and what the reaction has been on the ground there.
Well, you know, so far, I think people are feeling numb. Of course, I'm hearing from all over on social media and emails, and people are calling, and they just don't know how to feel. They're not even allowing themselves to believe that it's true, myself included. I can't believe it's true. But it is true, and it is something that we now have to deal with. And Mrs. Abe, too, I send my condolences to her. I covered the G7 spouses tour, and she's very, very likable, Akia Abe. And so now, of course, she's going through this terrible personal tragedy. But Japan is my second home, so I really grieve for my neighbors and for my friends there. And I wish that I were with them and we could be together right now.
Yeah, we can see the authenticity in your emotion, Professor Nancy Snow. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.